Welcome to the German Marshall Fund of the United States. My name is Heather Conley. I'm president of GMF, and we are absolutely delighted to have Foreign Minister Simon Coveney of Ireland, also Minister of Defense, two important positions. We are here to talk about the situation in Ukraine. Foreign Minister Coveney was the first foreign minister from the United Nations Security Council to visit Kiev 2 weeks ago. We want to talk about Ukraine, the transatlantic relationship, what has changed since February 24th, and of course talk about issues closer to home. So with that, welcome, Minister Coveney. We are so delighted that you are here, and I do want to take you back 2 weeks, if I can, to tell us about that extraordinary visit to Kiev. What did you see? What did you understand? And fast forwarding to where we are today, how do you see events playing out in Ukraine?
Gosh, not easy questions there. Well, first of all, like every other country in Europe, we recognize that what is currently happening in Ukraine, Russian aggression and this illegal war, is really changing how Europe sees itself and its security and its place in the world. It's really challenging what people understood to be acceptable norms. Nobody thought that in 2022 we would see a large-scale war at the heart of Europe. I mean, don't forget, Ukraine borders 4 EU member states and is a country that is on a pathway to EU membership. And the scale of this conflict in terms of the human consequence of it. I mean, think about this for a second. 5 million people have fled Ukraine into the EU in the space of 8 weeks. And if you compare it to other conflicts that have happened in recent decades, like Syria, for example, which is also an extremely tragic conflict, but it took 2 years for 1 million refugees from Syria to flee into Turkey. In the space of 2 months, we've seen almost 5 million leave Ukraine. And that is, I think, a reminder of just the scale of what we're seeing. Nothing like this has happened on the continent of Europe since the Second World War in terms of scale. And of course, it's continuing. And that's why many people see Ireland as a neutral country, militarily and on foreign policy. I can assure you we're not neutral on this issue. And from day one, we haven't been. This is a case of a large, aggressive country invading their neighbour and brutalising their population, breaching international law, breaching the UN Charter, and in our view, in all likelihood, committing multiple war crimes on a daily basis, although that will be proven in time by lawyers, not politicians, I hope. So I felt it was important to visit, to see for myself, to speak to both the foreign and defence ministers in Kiev, both of whom I know, and to visit some of the outskirts of Kiev where we know atrocities have taken place, so that I could speak with more certainty, having seen it myself, and hopefully with more credibility as well, at the UN Security Council, at the EU, in the Human Rights Council, and all of the other multilateral organisations that we're part of. We'll be chairing the Council of Europe for the next 6 months, and so for me, I think visiting was important. And so that's what I did. And we had some really good conversations in Kiev politically. The Foreign Ministry set up a meeting with Ukraine's chief negotiators who have been talking to Russia and to Moscow in terms of what could potentially be a basis for agreement of a ceasefire, and also obviously talking about how Ireland could help bilaterally and as a member of the Security Council and of the EU and of the European Union. So it was worthwhile. Perhaps the most emotive elements of that visit was, of course, visiting Bucha, which is a large town itself, it's about 35 minutes drive from the centre of Kiev. And it is simply a residential area devastated. Buildings in rubble, walls blackened, hardly a window unshattered in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of homes. And of course mass graves, where when I was there, the count at that point was 503 bodies had been taken out of mass graves. Only 4 bodies of soldiers in uniform, the rest civilians, many children. We visited what looked like a sort of a crash repair centre almost. It was a field with a lot of vehicles in it, a small number of military vehicles, but most of them were family cars with bullet holes in them. Some of them were just crushed because military vehicles had clearly driven over the top of them. Many of them had in Russian the words children written in white paint on the side. Clearly families trying to escape the conflict in the hope that by being clear that they weren't involved in the conflict or in any way linked to the military, that they would be allowed escape. That didn't happen for many of them. So real brutality. Unfortunately then a lot of stories also of sexual abuse and rape. A very graphic account of a number of bodies of women piled up on top of each other, set alight to try to effectively hide the evidence of sexual crimes and rape before they were murdered. So this is what war in Ukraine looks like. It's horrific, and it is civilians shouldering most of the pain and brunt of it. And this is why we have 5 million, predominantly women and children, escaping the country. So when people talk about weaponry and who's advancing or who's not, or whether a drone has been shot down today, or the number of tanks that have been destroyed on either side and so on, while of course that's very relevant because it gives us a sense as to where the military conflict is and where the balance is. For me, the real story here is the horror of civilians, not just in Bucha, because unfortunately that may only be a microcosm of what's actually happening in the bigger cities. Obviously Mariupol in particular, where we still have thousands of civilians hiding and essentially under siege, probably starving because of lack of food and water, hoping that some miracle may transpire that would allow them to escape. So it is just unbelievable to think that this could be happening in the heart of the continent of Europe, supposedly the centre of political stability in the world, and that Russia is waging this war with such extraordinary human consequences. They'll never be forgiven for this in Europe, never mind in Ukraine, which clearly will never forget and never forgive, and that's been made so clear to me from politicians, from citizens, from refugees. You know, we have 25,000, more than 25,000, I'd say it's probably 26,000 today, Ukrainians in Ireland fleeing this war. If you were to have a similar number in the US per head of capita, that would be 1.5 million people. 1.5 million people coming to the US in 7 weeks. That's the equivalent of what Ireland only is. I mean, if you look at Poland, it's 2.5 million people in the space of 7 weeks. So yeah, it really is quite extraordinary. And for me, the real challenge here, of course, we need to support Ukraine. Ireland is supporting Ukraine militarily, from a humanitarian point of view, from a political point of view, from a legal perspective, in terms of the International Criminal Court. And you know, financially, we will continue to keep supporting them in all of those ways. But the real challenge here is, how do we put a stop to this? You know, how can we create the basis for a ceasefire that can stop this killing? And how long will it take?
Minister, I think the power of your words, but that power of the Russians will never be forgiven for this, that we cannot rebuild, go back to normal. I think there was some anticipation at the beginning of the conflict. Well, if we can get that immediate ceasefire, sort of refreeze this conflict, perhaps we can find a way back. That is gone. And I think that is really, for those of us that are trying to find the path forward, I think that is a key question.
Yeah, I mean, when I say the Russians will never be forgiven for this, I mean that, but that doesn't mean that we can't find a way to bring about a ceasefire and try to reforge a new relationship. But it'll be a different relationship, one where trust is fundamentally broken, where effectively, everybody knows we're being lied to, and the disinformation that we're getting from the Russian side, the disinformation that Russian people are getting from their own government, which, by the way, will be exposed in time. History tells the truth. That's a fact. The truth may not be evident today across Russia in terms of what's actually happening in Ukraine today. And propaganda and slick disinformation campaigns and so on can maintain support for this war in Russia for a period of time. There's no doubt about that. But who knows how many Russian troops have lost their lives, young men and young women, many of whom didn't even know they were going to war. They thought they were on military exercises. Some have defected. So it's in the thousands. The estimate is somewhere between 10 and 25,000. We just don't know. But the truth will come out here in the end. And I believe that it'll be quite shocking, actually, for many Russians who simply don't believe that what is happening today is happening in their name, and aren't being presented with the facts and the truth. But as I say, as a small country, but as a small country with quite a loud voice, given the privilege that we have in terms of some of the bodies that we're on at the moment, we want to use that voice to expose what's happening, to hold people to account, but more than anything else, to try and find a way to stop it. The motivation here cannot be to weaken Russia for the future or to bring an end to President Putin's rule. The first priority here has got to be to stop the death in Ukraine, and to find a basis for a ceasefire and an agreement that can last, and to do that in a way that includes Ukraine in everything we do around efforts and decisions, and in no way to undermine their capacity to choose their own future direction. Ukraine is a sovereign, independent member of the international community. They are entitled to choose the direction of travel that they want their country to be on. That is one of a path to EU membership, and all that comes with that in terms of stability, modern democracy, tolerance, diversity, economic growth and expansion, globalization, all of those positive things that Ukraine are now fighting and giving thousands of lives a week to try to continue to pursue. And we have to protect that while at the same time trying to find a way of bringing about a basis for a ceasefire and a peace agreement with Russia.
Minister, has the United Nations failed? Secretary General Guterres was in Moscow, in Kiev now. President Zelensky has had some very harsh words for a member of the Security Council that is committing war crimes. Some believe committing acts of genocide, and it has failed to stop the conflict. What is your assessment as a member of the Security Council right now?
Well, first of all, I'm a big believer in the UN. For small countries, the UN really matters because it is really the only credible body that is there to protect the international order of things, in terms of international law. But the truth is the UN fails all the time. It failed on Syria, failed in Libya, it failed in Yemen. It's failed to get an agreement between Israelis and Palestinians, but it keeps trying. So this is an imperfect body. Unfortunately, the use of the veto by any one of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council means that sometimes atrocities and breaches of international law go unchecked. And that's why when Russia vetoed a resolution on the war in Ukraine in the Security Council, Ireland and other countries immediately took the resolution to the General Assembly of the UN, where we got huge support for a very strongly worded resolution. In fact, the only countries that voted with Russia against that resolution were Belarus, Syria, Eritrea, and North Korea.
My mother would say that is not the company we wish to
Now that says a lot to me. I mean, some countries abstained, but they were the only countries that voted against. So Russia is very isolated, even though they're very influential. They're very isolated at the moment. And so while the UN has not been able to stop this war yet, the UN can and is playing an important role in maintaining pressure on Russia to bring about a ceasefire, and I think that role shouldn't be underestimated. The Security Council is a platform where we need to keep raising the issues. I mean, there was a reason why days after I visited Kiev, I came to New York to brief the Security Council directly on what I saw. And the Irish perspective, which is an EU perspective and a US perspective, we're very, very close on this issue. It's really pulled the transatlantic partnership together. I mean, everything that I think President Putin and the Kremlin had calculated on has essentially been turned on its head. I mean, in my view, the decision, and putting my defense hat on for a second, the decision to invade Ukraine now, I think, was based on a perception that the EU was weak and divided, because there have been divisions in the EU. There's new German leadership. We were going into a new French presidential election. The UK have left the European Union, and there's been some tension around how that Brexit process has unfolded. The transatlantic relationship, isn't as strong as it's been at certain times in the past. This was pre the war, although I think the Biden administration is doing a lot to correct that, by the way, to their credit. But perceptions around divisions in Washington. So I think the judgment in the Kremlin was that the West is weak right now. This is a moment, and if you're going to invade Ukraine, now is the time to do it. And I think it was a massive miscalculation. First of all, I think Russia has completely underestimated the resolve and the strength and the courage of the Ukrainian people, which is hard to understand because Ukraine and Russia understand each other very well. They are interwoven in terms of family connections and so on. But certainly that was a huge miscalculation. I think President Putin completely underestimated President Zelensky in terms of his own resilience and
strength.
Well, I mean, extraordinary sort of power of communication and ability to lead and sustain that effort as he has done. But I think Russia has completely underestimated the EU as well. Like I've been in politics for 23 years. I've been in the European Parliament. I've been privileged to be a foreign minister for 5 years or so. I've been defence minister on 2 different occasions. So I'm pretty involved in the EU project. I chaired the Common Agricultural Policy Reform, Common Fisheries Policy Reform in the EU. Like I'm a big believer in the EU in terms of what the project is about. Peace, stability, partnership, compromise, diversity. All the things that the EU represents. But the EU in recent years has been a place of some tension in terms of some debates. Trying to figure out its relationship with China, its relationship with Russia, unable to agree a common approach on things like migration. And what this has done, it has forced, in a dramatic way, over a very short period of time, and I mean days, it's forced the EU to collectively reflect on what it's really about in terms of the values that underpin EU membership and why it's there at all, in terms of stability and guaranteeing protections for its citizens and so on. And, within the space of 2 weeks, I think it was, we agreed, I think, 5 packages of sanctions, one after the other. Any one of those packages would normally have taken months to negotiate, and there would have been differences of perspective and opinions and so on. It's seen countries like Germany change their foreign policy overnight. It's seen countries like Finland and Sweden now, in my view, on an irreversible road to NATO membership, probably before the end of the year. It's got countries like Ireland questioning security and defence policy in a very fundamental way. And within the next few months, I think you'll see Ireland make decisions to increase our defence budget quite significantly. I'll be bringing recommendations to government on that in June. So all of the things that I think the Kremlin banked on actually have become the realization of the opposite to that. And then, of course, the transatlantic relationship and the tension between the UK and the EU around Brexit has been sort of set aside. We're working together on sanctions packages and, of course, on support packages for Ukraine. And can I just say that Anthony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, President Biden, they've been fantastic through this process in terms of the transatlantic relationship and sort of the honesty of the conversations we've been having and continue to have around what we can do together, not just in terms of our own relationship, but how we can influence other countries in the world as well to take a position on the illegality of this war and to help to bring it to an end. And I think Russia has found themselves very isolated very quickly. And that is why I'm a big believer in a maximalist approach when it comes to sanctions, because the more isolated Russia is, the more this war costs them in terms of relationships and economic consequences, then I think the more likely they are to agree to bring it to an end. So we're not doing this because we hate Russia. We don't. Europe actually, or the EU, wants a good relationship with Russia, but we simply cannot stand by and watch this act of aggression, this brutality unfold in Europe, and we won't do it. And the resolve and the determination within the European Union on this issue is like something I've never seen before in the EU, which for me actually is a reminder of what the European Union is really about in the context of what happened after the Second World War.
Minister, let me talk a little bit about putting your Minister of Defense hat on, how this has begun a process of reconceptualizing perhaps Ireland's security and defense posture. And you noted Sweden and Finland, two countries that I think Ireland has looked towards as powerful members of the EU, not members of NATO, completely rethinking their security posture. Now, this has been in the works. The Commission on Defense Forces just released a report to you in February, which laid out some scenarios of increasing Irish defense spending. You mentioned you'll be reviewing that in June. Will the potential decision of welcoming Finland and Sweden into NATO create more conversation about that? You saw a Russian military exercise recently that we've now seen the robustness of Irish fishermen as they encountered a Russian military exercise. This has really created a conversation in Ireland. Tell us where this is going. How can the U.S. be a partner? How do you partner more thoroughly with the European Union, even with NATO potentially?
Yeah, I mean, when John F. Kennedy came to Ireland in 1963, he was the first president to visit in person Ireland, and he spoke in the Irish Parliament, and he said, that he recognised that Ireland takes its own approach to foreign policy, but is not neutral when it comes to liberty versus tyranny, and I think that is a quote that's probably as relevant today as it was then. And so while Irish neutrality effectively means that we are non-aligned militarily. In other words, we're not signed up to any military alliance that would suck us into a conflict. But that doesn't mean we don't take sides in conflicts. We do all the time. Ireland isn't neutral in Mali or Yemen or or Libya or Ukraine. And we are very active and vocal. And we have, per head of capita, more peacekeepers in the field than any other country in Europe, in different parts of the world on UN peacekeeping missions. And we have had for 60 years. So our neutrality is an active neutrality. I don't believe that there is majority support in Ireland at this stage anyway for NATO membership or to join a structured military alliance. But I do believe there's a recognition that Ireland needs to talk more about collective defence, collective cooperation with other countries, particularly in the European Union. We're doing that, by the way, already. You know, I mean, we've had a number of projects that we've partnered with NATO on, in Afghanistan, for example, a number of years ago around demining areas. And we have lots of projects that we work with other EU countries on in a structured way. We've just signed off on what's called the strategic compass, which effectively is it's a
national security strategy for the EU,
basically,
sort of in our parlance.
Basically, yeah. You know, it's basically a common security and defence strategy for the EU for the next 10 years. Ireland was very much part of designing that. So I think there's
step by step. It sounds like step by step.
Well, yeah, well, step by step, but I think we still see a value to being outside of formal military alliances. It allows Ireland to speak differently and build relationships with other parts of the world that may be outside of the NATO structure. And I think that for us is important. And we have traditionally played that role. And on the UN Security Council, that has been helpful too. I mean, for example, we've been quite involved in trying to bring a conclusion to the Iranian nuclear deal negotiations. And I think our perceived neutrality on issues like that have been helpful. But having said that, I think we are very aware now of core security issues and defence issues within the European Union and ourselves in terms of cyber attacks and so on. This perception that because Ireland is neutral and we don't have any traditional enemies in the world, therefore we don't have to spend money on defence and we can just, you know, live in
safe in your neutrality.
Safe in our neutrality. I think those perceptions are shown up to be, you know, not a reflection of reality any longer. So I mean, we now have, and you know, we put a very distinguished group of people in place to look at Irish defence policy and, sorry, not Irish defence policy, on the Irish Defence Forces in terms of resourcing, structures, capacity and so on. And we have a very detailed evidence base now to make decisions. And in my view, Ireland will be making quite significant financial decisions in the next few months to increase our defence spending by certainly 50%, you know, in the course of the next few years, maybe more. And increase our numbers and defence infrastructure, if you like. That's the first step. But I think we'll also continue to have political discussions around what common security and defence policy actually means for Ireland, and perhaps have a more, I think, frank and honest conversation around what's needed there. And I'll be leading that debate, I suspect.
Well, we will follow it closely. And I think it's quite interesting because I think the European Union is going to evolve its common security and defence policy. Really, what does Article 42.7 and showing solidarity when an EU member believes its security is challenged? What is that contribution? I think the French have a very specific view of what a European defense outlook looks like. I think there's a NATO partnership, a strengthening just of that partnership that could be beneficial.
But I think the way the NATO partnership works, and I say this now representing a country that isn't in NATO, but I speak to NATO partners all the time. And there is certainly a clear debate in Europe now on what's called strategic autonomy.
What does that mean to you?
Led by France, and to a certain extent Germany too, but others as well. What that means is that there's a recognition that perhaps from a security perspective and from a military perspective, there was too much reliance on the United States within the NATO partnership for Europe's ability to be able to make interventions around the world to end conflicts, to bring about peace, to protect itself and its interests. And so I think strategic autonomy effectively means that Europe would increase its own capacity within the NATO structure and outside of the NATO structure to be able to be more efficient and more comprehensive in terms of how the European Union can respond or choose to respond when it needs to. And that is partly what the strategic compass is all about. So, for example, we would have a rapid response capacity of about 5,000 military personnel to be able to intervene at very short notice to prevent conflict in different parts of the world or to respond to aggression or a natural disaster. And that kind of rapid response capacity is something that Europe recognises that it needs to be able to do itself and not have to rely on other partners to do. That doesn't mean that we're drifting away from the partnership with the United States. It simply means that within that partnership, there is somewhat of a capacity or a power shift. And I think the US would welcome that actually Europe would increase its capacity so that it could work in partnership with the United States in a more effective way around the world.
I think there's a slight nuance, meaning a strong European defense pillar within NATO, absolutely. Making sure that the EU dimension of that is not in any way duplicative, but it provides that mechanism of support in areas where NATO isn't covering. I think that, to me, some interpret it differently, that the EU needs to have the strategic autonomy of a separate pillar. That speaks to duplication if it's trying to do similar functions, I think.
Well, that depends whether you see NATO as the basis for EU security policy. Don't forget, as of now, Finland, Sweden, Ireland, Austria, Malta, Cyprus, all of these countries are not in NATO right now. So I think because I think it is a when Finland and Sweden likely join NATO, then of course the group of countries that aren't in NATO will be smaller within the EU, and that will change the balance and the perspective undoubtedly. But I do think that the EU will want to maintain its own capacity and its own decision making, just like the United States does. In relation to its place in the world, how it protects that, how it advocates on the basis of its value system and so on. But I think it'll also want to strengthen the transatlantic partnership. And, who knows who will be in the White House in the future? I don't think the EU can rely necessarily on a permanent close relationship. We saw during the last presidency, for example, a lot of tension transatlantic. Between the White House and the European Union on certain issues. So within the European Union, we see the Biden administration as wanting to build a very close and structured alliance, if you like, on a transatlantic basis. And we need to grasp that opportunity and build strong connections, I think, during the lifetime of this administration. Because there were lessons, I think, for the European Union, and that's where this whole strategic autonomy debate began, because Europe started to have the debate of we need to do this for ourselves, potentially.
It's a hedging strategy.
It is, to be honest, and that's necessary too, and it's necessary in this side of the Atlantic as well. The United States has the capacity to do a lot on its own. It's a superpower. It's the superpower. The EU also has to have capacity to do a lot on its own in terms of protecting its own interests and ensuring that its perspective on the world and its value system, its promotion of democracy, its interventions to protect people from aggression and brutality is effective, and that we've got the capacity to do that. Of course, we want to partner with the United States and others, just like we're doing on Ukraine right now. Countries like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, obviously the UK, are all partners in that effort as well. And that's an alliance that I think we can build on.
I think the question, and it gets back to the decisions that the government will be making in June. Does Europe have the will and the means to support both a NATO strategy and strengthening NATO's obligations for those NATO members, and do the EU members have that? And that's always a tough decision on resources.
I think some people misread this because they see the European Union as a country, and it's not. The European Union is a collection of countries that agree to pool sovereignty in certain areas. It's not the United States of Europe. It's quite different to that. And so within the European Union, we respect individual countries, their sovereignty, their constitutions, their different approaches and history around foreign policy and international relations. That's what makes the EU so complex in some ways when it comes to foreign and security policy, because each country has its own foreign policy, as well as a commitment to the EU, which is why the response to Ukraine has been so remarkable. Because if you take a country like Poland or Lithuania or Latvia and their historic relationship with Russia versus, Portugal, Ireland and Malta, and their historic relationship with Russia, entirely different. Yet the EU has come together in a really, I think, impressive and strong way around a united message to Moscow. And I think, if anything, that message will get stronger, not weaker.
But is that message united? And I want to just go back to something you said at the very beginning. Over the weekend, Secretary Lloyd Austin, Secretary of Defense Austin, Secretary of State Blinken traveled to Kiev, Warsaw, and we started to hear a new formulation, I believe, of U.S. policy. I think we're still unpacking that. We need Ukraine to win and Russia to be weakened. And you just said at the beginning, that is not where we are focusing. Obviously, the immediacy of a ceasefire, humanitarian corridors. Are you concerned that the transatlantic relationship doesn't have an agreed sort of policy outcome here? Or does it have to be resolved in some ways on the battlefield to help shape a negotiated outcome?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. I think for now, it is being resolved on the battlefield. And we have to do everything we can to ensure that Ukraine can defend themselves. And that is happening. Hundreds of millions of euros of military aid and support, which Ireland is supporting as well, is being given to the Ukrainian military to defend themselves against aggression. And that is, I think, an absolute justification for what we're doing. So yes, as President Zelensky has said, for now, this is a military conflict, and we need to be as effective as we can be on the battlefield. But we've also got to be trying to think about when are the moments in time when, if the military conflict as it is today results in neither side winning comprehensively, how do we find a basis for a political agreement that can bring about a ceasefire to bring relief to enormous populations who are currently living under a war set of conditions. So I think we can do both. I'm a big believer in supporting Ukraine militarily. I'm a big believer in, as I say, a maximalist approach to sanctions. And by the way, we haven't got to where we need to get to yet.
Ireland, 6, oil. Do you think EU will ban oil?
Well, I certainly hope they will.
What about this ruble question? Because now you have a division of who is paying the Russians for their energy, whether they'll pay for it or whether they're not. Are you concerned about that division?
Yeah, well, I mean, 2 EU member states effectively have refused to pay for gas and oil in rubles, and they're perfectly entitled to make that decision. I think they've made the right decision. And Russia has decided to make an example of them, presumably to try and intimidate other countries into paying in rubles in terms of trying to protect the value of the Russian currency.
The Hungarian government is paying in rubles.
Yeah. So for me, this is about EU solidarity and about, this is about supporting countries like Poland when they are targeted by Russia. And I think you will see, and you've heard very strong solidarity from President van der Leyen and others in relation to supporting EU member states that are in this position. I mean, our preference is that we would have a an approach to the current sanctions that would effectively cut off Russian oil and gas. Now, that's easier for Ireland to say than other countries because we don't have a lot of Russian gas coming into Ireland, and we don't have a lot of Russian oil either coming into Ireland. So, but for countries that have 40, 60 or 80% reliance on Russian oil and gas in terms of energy, it's a much more difficult choice. And they are looking, of course, at how they can substitute in the context of taking that approach. But we know that by the end of this year, the reliance on Russian oil and gas will be dramatically reduced, and that within the next number of years, the stated intention is to move away from a reliance altogether on Russian carbon-based fuels. And Europe has a very clear plan to deliver that. The problem with that, of course, is if this is done over time, it doesn't send a dramatic message today and next week, which is what I think is needed in order to try and bring about the conditions for a ceasefire. So, if you're too incremental over too long a period of time, you're prolonging the war. We know that we're spending, when I say we, the EU collectively, is spending 700 or 800 million euros a day on Russian oil and gas. And while we are supporting Ukraine in the billions, it is, there is also a fundamental question that we have to ask ourselves. Is our purchasing of Russian oil and gas funding this war machine? And undoubtedly, well, undoubtedly, it is playing a part in that. And so, for me, if you believe in peace and the absence of war, you've got to use the other tools that you have available to you to the maximum extent possible. And there has to be a message sent to the Kremlin that this is going to cost them significantly to continue this war. I don't believe Russia will respond to appeals on humanitarian basis to end the war. I believe what will change perspectives in the Kremlin is if there is a significant cost for Russia for its continuation, and that's where sanctions, I think, are very important. Sanctions policy is always a double-edged sword, and it doesn't always work.
Sacrifice for those values.
But for me, the EU, if it wants to bring about an end to this war in the short to medium term, well, then I think we have to do more on sanctions, and that's the Irish perspective.
Minister, in our last 2 minutes, we wanted to keep the focus on Ukraine, on the transatlantic relationship, the shifts we're seeing geopolitically after February 24th. But I would be remiss if I didn't just spend the last 2 minutes talking about one of the reasons that you were actually visiting Washington. You talked a little bit about the Northern Ireland Protocol. And I would love your reflections as we head towards very important elections in Northern Ireland on May the 5th. We've really heard some concerning statements coming out of London about suspending portions of the Northern Ireland Protocol, potentially, seeking the nullification of the Northern Ireland Protocol. Help us understand, for an American audience in particular, but globally, what do we need to think about as we head towards May 5th and then after May 5th, when the potential of having Sinn Féin leading, or at least co-leading a new power-sharing executive in Belfast?
Well, you've told me we've got 2 minutes, which is
so unfair.
which is a challenge because there's a lot to unpack there.
Sorry.
Look, in simple terms, the institutions of the peace agreement in Northern Ireland, which are 24 years old this year, it'll be the 25th anniversary next year, they're probably under more pressure now than at any time in that 25-year period. And I don't say that lightly. So we have, largely because of Brexit, seen a polarisation of politics in Northern Ireland, a refusal to cooperate on the side of some parties in Northern Ireland with North-South cooperation, which is an essential part of the institutions of the peace agreement. Devolved government doesn't function and hasn't been functioning in Northern Ireland for some time. Again, because one party decided to pull out of devolved government on the basis that they didn't like how Brexit is unfolding in the context of the protocol in Northern Ireland, which essentially was designed and agreed between the UK government and the EU to manage and contain the disruption of Brexit on the island of Ireland. So in simple terms, the reason why Brexit has been so difficult to manage on the island of Ireland is that the Good Friday Agreement, which is the peace agreement, and collective EU membership between the UK and Ireland meant that essentially the border on the island of Ireland between North and South was largely invisible. So there was no trade border because we were in the same customs union and single market in the EU. There was no security border because we had a peace agreement. And the regulatory environment North and South was the same because it was consistent with EU regulation. So in other words, on the island of Ireland, for the last 25 years or close to it, we've effectively had a peace agreement that has also facilitated trade, movement, relationship building. And so we've had an all-island economy, even though there's been two different jurisdictions on the island of Ireland, Northern Ireland part of the United Kingdom, unless and until a majority of people in Northern Ireland want to change that situation, which is the principle of consent in the peace agreement. And we've had an economy that has reinforced better relations. The problem with Brexit for that structure is that Brexit is all about differentiation, regulatory divergence. And when you leave a single market, leave a customs union, leave a political union, well, then you create borders. By definition, you create borders. And so the idea that it's possible to reimpose a border on the island of Ireland between North and South, a physical border checking goods coming and going, when we have literally tens of thousands of vehicles crossing that border, every week, is something that posed huge challenges for negotiators in the context of Brexit. And so it was the British government that effectively proposed this idea that you would put a solution in place specifically for Northern Ireland, which became known as the Northern Ireland Protocol. And effectively, after some negotiation between the two sides, it was agreed that Northern Ireland, of course, would stay in the United Kingdom, unless and until a majority decides to change that. But it would also stay in the EU single market for goods, to prevent any need for any trade border infrastructure. The price of that was that there would need to be some checks then on goods coming from Great Britain into Northern Ireland, because of course those goods, even though they're staying in the United Kingdom between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, they are travelling from Great Britain into the EU single market in Northern Ireland. And the British government signed that deal. It became international law. It was ratified. Prime Minister Boris Johnson won a big majority in a general election on the back of that deal. And unfortunately, for quite some time now, the British government has been trying to unwind that deal, and now have their spokespeople openly saying, well, that we only signed up to the Northern Ireland Protocol on the basis that it would be reformed and changed afterwards, which is, an extraordinary thing to say in many ways. It's like, you spend 3 years putting a deal together and you sign off on that. You make it international law in the context of an international treaty, and then a few months later you say, well, actually we didn't really mean it in the first place. and so I accept that there are issues that we need to resolve together in the context of how the protocol works. For many unionists in Northern Ireland, they see checks on goods coming from Great Britain into Northern Ireland as checks on goods travelling within the United Kingdom, and they are offended by that. But that is what their government signed up to, even if it wasn't fully honest about that at the time. And we want to minimise those checks. We want to ensure that trade across the Irish Sea between Great Britain and Ireland and Great Britain and Northern Ireland is as free and as seamless as possible. And I think the EU is up for maximum flexibility here. But what we're not up for is essentially trashing the whole deal and starting all over again. And I'll finish on this, because this is not only an issue for Northern Ireland, although it has huge consequences in Northern Ireland. It's also an issue for the Republic of Ireland, because of course if the protocol doesn't function, well then Ireland's place in the single market of the European Union is also uncertain, because we can no longer guarantee the integrity of that single market in terms of the goods that are coming into it from Great Britain. And that is why Ireland's place in Europe and Ireland's place in the EU single market is reliant on the protocol functioning, despite the fact that it's causing huge division within Northern Ireland. And it is risking undermining the very institutions of the peace process. So when we talk about Ukraine and the need to find a basis for a ceasefire and a peace process that can last and sustain into the future to stop people killing each other. We are very conscious of the fact that Ireland and Britain together, with the support of the United States, have a template for arguably the most successful peace process on the planet, over the last 30 years, that has sustained. And so it's important that we protect that. It's important in Washington, it's important in Dublin, and it's important in London, and it's important in Belfast. And after the elections on the 5th of May, we are also seeing political change in Northern Ireland, which is going to add to the pressure. So for the first time, there may well be a nationalist stroke Republican party that's the largest party in Northern Ireland, as opposed to a unionist party. And that in itself is going to create tensions. We have a difference of opinion between the two governments on how we deal with the legacy of the past, because we had agreed on how to do that in what was called the Stormont House Agreement, which the British government no longer wants to implement. And of course, we also have this protocol Brexit-related issue, which we've got to find a way of solving together. And from my perspective, Northern Ireland has enough tension, enough polarisation, without having to carry this burden as well. And so the British and Irish governments together, working with the EU, have got to find a way of implementing the protocol with the flexibility necessary to create acceptance for it. But to be perfectly honest with you, I know, because I speak to the EU a lot on this, and I'm a big advocate for that flexibility. The EU is up for doing that, but we've got to have a British government that will be honest about what they signed up to, and also work with us on compromises and flexibility that can create something that's acceptable for everybody. So far, from my experience in the last 12 months, we haven't had a British government that's been willing to do that. But I hope after the elections in Northern Ireland that might change.
It's an extraordinary moment, not only...
But can I just finish by saying...
Sure, of course.
I'm almost sort of sorry to be talking about things and the technicality of things like the protocol when we are seeing thousands of people dying on the continent of Europe. In many ways, God, I mean, when you think about it, what are we even talking about a protocol for? We should be compromising, settling this issue, showing that peace works on the island of Ireland, and focusing on how we can bring some of that experience and some of those learnings to a much bigger conflict and a much bigger tragedy in Ukraine.
I could not think of a better concluding thought to remain focused, but thank you so much for giving us your tremendous insights. We're so grateful that you could be with us. Thank you again.